Welcome to Beyond the Canopy, the podcast where we explore the most innovative approaches to ecosystem restoration and impact-driven investments. I'm your host, Alexander, and today we are talking about something that still surprises many people. Big companies as powerful drivers of forest protection and restoration. So at the first glance, corporations and forest conservation sound like opposites. Big business are often associated with deforestation, land conversion, and climate risk. But that's not the whole story. And today we're going to explore WWF Forest Forward program, how it works with companies to protect and restore forests at scale, and what kind of real measurable impact these partnerships can deliver. So we will delve into leading companies building resilient supply chains, move beyond basic ESG reporting to verifiable impact and trust, and what the future of corporate sustainability looks like in a world demanding credible action. Our guest today is one of the key architects of these corporate conservation partnerships. Tim Cronin, he's the global lead of WWF's Forest Forward program. Tim's career spans from working on complex forest and climate policy in Asia to designing global programs that help companies to transform how they source, use, and invest in forest. He spends his time at the intersection of business strategy, forest science, and impact measurements. Tim, welcome to Beyond the Canopy.
Thank you very much, Alexander. Pleasure to be here.
I will give a quick introduction because this topic is not like a typical day-to-day topic for business leaders. So I would like to give a little bit of a context. It has been found that strong sustainability strategy within companies is directly linked to better financial performance, lower risk, and stronger brands. So there are a lot of studies by Oxford, McKinsey, Deloitte, and Harvard Business School that really shows that these ESG practices boost financial performance, can help to reduce business risk, attract talents, and such corporate commitments to environmental programs like the WWF Forest Forward program can become powerful engines for conservation and restoration. Just to give you a figure, through Forest Forward, corporate partners are helping to conserve 1.3 million hectares of vital forest and improve the management of an additional 2.7 million hectares. So now turning to you, Tim, your career has taken, it started basically with on-the-ground policy work on issues like REDD+ in Indonesia, to your current role leading WWF's Forest Forward program globally. Can you take us back a bit, how it all started, how you got into this field?
Sure. Thank you, Alexander. It's a little while ago now, but I think really what took me into this direction was working for a program or an organization in Australia known as Landcare, which is actually, it's quite unique and it's now gone global, but it was, I guess, what you might call an unholy alliance between the National Farmers Federation here and the Australian Conservation Foundation, which were,
Yeah.
I guess, traditional combatants, if you like, around environment versus the economy. And yet there was a real intersection there of mutual interest in recognition of the fact that well-managed lands are actually good for business, good for productivity. And if we restore degraded landscapes, it's not just good for biodiversity, ecosystem health. That translates directly into positive outcomes for farmers, for communities, and for economies. So it was this real kind of intersection, as I said, between a conservation agenda and a development agenda. And so landing in my probably early to mid-20s in an organization like that really shaped my thinking around conservation and development, and that's really where my career has centered since, around how do we maximize those synergies, how do we get those win-wins, and how do we recognize that it's not an either or when we think about the economy or the environment. They're so intrinsically linked, and we need to get beyond that kind of that rhetoric, that polarization. So that took me then to Indonesia. I wanted to kind of explore a little bit and see what does this look like around the world in tropical forests. And I was fortunate enough to land at the Centre for International Forestry Research, or CIFOR, in 2007, and it was part of an AusAid youth ambassador program. And I was fortunate, after a number of years, I spent working in and around the Asia Pacific region, moving back to Australia and landing with WWF, the World Wide Fund for Nature, in Australia, just at a time when quite an innovative new program was building globally within WWF called the Market Transformation Initiative, or MTI. And it was really about using markets and trade and global supply chains as a force for good. And it was very deliberately focused on a small number of soft commodities that were driving the bulk of environmental degradation globally. When I say soft commodities, essentially forestry, fisheries, and agriculture, influencing and changing the behavior of 1 or 2 billion farmers and foresters and fishermen across the world is going to be a tough ask. At the other end of the supply chain, changing the behavior of 8 billion consumers of these products is an equally tough ask. But if we can really narrow our sights on those 100 or so companies, the big traders, the big retailers, the big manufacturers that are controlling the production and trade of these soft commodities, and we can convince them through various ways to change production practices and to put in place the market signals and incentives to make those changes on the ground in the landscapes that matter most from an ecological and biodiversity point of view, then we can really shift, how these markets work and shift them from an extractive approach to a regenerative one. So we made quite a lot of headway through that program. And again, it was another perspective, if you like, on this conservation development intersection and how to use kind of business and markets as a force for good.
I want to say that for business leaders who are listening today, let's frame Forest Forward not just as a conservation initiative, but more as a strategic tool, right? And if, for example, I'm as a company want to work with the WWF Forest Forward program, how would you explain the program to me?
Well, essentially, Forest Forward is a platform for private sector leadership on forests. At WWF, we're a large organization, we're a broad organization. We have a huge amount of action and influence across forests, as well as a whole range of other issues globally. And we have a lot of partnerships, including corporate partnerships, doing a lot of good things, including on forests. We frame our expectations, if you like, around our participation in that program through a lens of commit, act, and collaborate. So we expect ambitious commitments to forests from all of our partner companies, starting with removing deforestation from their supply chains and their operations, and progressively promoting forest conservation, restoration, and sustainable management. We also expect tangible, time-bound action, and we hold our partners accountable to that. We see a lot of corporate and public sector commitments globally around forests, and if all these commitments had been met, there'd be no deforestation issue anymore. But unfortunately, commitments are often not followed up by action. So that's the most important thing, is that we work with companies to translate their commitments and their intent into actions and into impacts. And we do that in a way that enables us to connect and combine and aggregate, the many impacts across our program, so that they can, the various partnerships, the various partners can be part of something bigger. And then thirdly, we expect and we promote and we catalyze collaboration, because we know that
Yep.
these problems, they're wicked problems, they're complex problems. They cannot be solved alone. But when we bring these partnerships together, when we bring these like-minded stakeholders, each of which has huge amount of expertise in any particular field, a lot of influence, a lot of networks, and we combine that with our own network within WWF, it can be a pretty powerful force for good. So really it's about catalyzing, commitment, action, and collaboration so that we can halt and
Yeah.
reverse forest
Yeah.
loss globally.
Yeah. And can you explain a little bit about the core pillars of this engagement? So in which areas can organizations, let's say, help to not cut down forests and stabilize ecosystems? So what are the kind of activities these organizations can do?
Yeah, there's a huge breadth of activities and interventions, if you like, that we work on with these partner companies, but they're broadly framed around what we call 3 action areas.
Mhm.
So first of those is responsible sourcing. So many of our partners are major multinational brands and
Yeah.
manufacturers or retailers with significant forest footprints, and we
Yeah.
work with them first and foremost on their responsible sourcing policy and practice
Mhm.
to reduce their forest footprint, and to make sure that they are addressing their impacts and dependencies on forests and forest resources. So that's one action area, responsible sourcing. At the other end of forest-related supply chains in the forest, we work with companies on improving forest management. So that's a pretty kind of a broad term that encompasses a lot of different actions on the ground, primarily focused around better management practices, particularly for forest product producers, complemented by increasing conservation and restoration across those managed lands. And thirdly, recognizing that we need to take a broad and holistic approach. We don't want to just work on site-specific kind of management units. We want to position these within broad landscapes. We work on mobilizing private sector finance into strategic landscapes.
Mhm.
Um, and that again takes a number of different forms and involves a number of different drivers. Increasingly, we're engaged in blended finance instruments that complements private sector finance, whether it's philanthropic, whether it's commercial, with public and other different sources of finance, so we can really transform how lands are managed at that landscape scale.
Yeah. No, pretty cool. So, when, let's say, corporates approach you or you get in such a partnership, what's really behind the decision to go beyond like this typical compliance stuff and join a program like Force Forward with commitments? So, what is their motivation so behind it?
Yeah, that's really key, understanding where companies are coming from. And to answer that question, well, first of all, it's a lot of different things.
Yeah,
Different companies come at, our
with
partnerships,
different
our
reasons. So,
collaborations.
yeah,
Yeah, very, very different reasons. But I'll take a step back in answering that question just to describe a little bit about the evolution or trajectory that I've seen these conversations take over
yeah,
the last 10 to 15 years that I've been involved in this kind of work. Um, it started 10 or 15 years ago, these conversations in very much around reputational risk.
yeah,
So, we've identified or we've been exposed as having significant impacts on forest areas, on deforestation. We want to make sure that, we're doing the right thing, that
yeah,
these kind of exposés are going to stop. Can you help us?
yeah.
What do we need to do? What does good look
Yeah.
like? So
And
that's the
it's
kind of
it's a
reputational
real
risk.
it's a realistic risk for a big brand, a big company, if they're
Yeah,
accused publicly doing illegal logging, deforestation. That's of course a big problem for them and could
it
really
is.
harm their brand and also revenues, right?
That's right. So there's a commercial imperative there, driven primarily by that kind of reputational risk
Okay. Yeah.
lens. We've seen more and more drivers from a regulatory point of view. So laws are changing.
Mhm.
If I want to gain or maintain market
Yeah.
access, I'm going to have to do something differently. And we've seen that particularly around illegal logging
Yeah.
legislation. There's been a number of trade policies enacted globally that prohibits the import of timber associated with illegal logging. That's forced companies to really, either change the practices or certainly invest in better transparency and traceability so that they can
Yeah.
understand what they're buying, where they're buying it from, and they can demonstrate appropriate due diligence and controls are in place. And we're seeing
Yeah.
that played out now and expanded into deforestation, so agricultural commodities, and many would be aware of the European deforestation regulation and
Yeah.
the extent to which that's now
EUDR.
driving a huge amount of action and investment in decoupling business models from deforestation, which is really something we've been advocating and working with companies for 10 years or more. That is now shifted from that kind of voluntary space now into a compliant space, which is a really interesting development in terms of scaling. But I think the biggest development that we've seen, and I think in many ways the most promising development in a perverse kind of a way, is in the last few years around physical risk based on climate change or ecosystem degradation, which is really
Yeah.
based around this recognition that we have a dependency, we have a business or economic dependency on nature, on natural resources. And what I'm seeing in my supply chain is it is at risk from climate
Yeah.
change, whether that's fires, floods, drought,
Yeah.
or ecosystem degradation more broadly.
Yeah.
And, I live in Australia, and the most obvious manifestation of that scenario was 4 or 5 years ago, where we had catastrophic bushfires that
Right.
were beamed all over the world, with the koala at the at the front lines, where we had 14 or 15 million hectares burn in the southeast of Australia. And so that kind of changed the narrative very much
Yeah.
from that kind of reputational issue or political discourse around forests and deforestation into a really tangible recognition of this is real, it's happening,
Yeah.
and if I don't get out in front of it, then my business model is going to collapse. And that was particularly evident for kind of land use sectors, forestry and agriculture. So that's that
Yeah.
kind of event, fires here, but playing out in different forms across the world, has really
Yeah.
kind of shifted the thinking, shifted the conversation. It's moved it out of the PR team into the boardroom. And
Mhm.
really what that's done is it's supercharged the economic and business case for investing in nature.
Yeah.
And so more and more our work under Forest Forward is seeking to be positioned in that space. So the way we like to describe it is, how do we demonstrate and enhance the economic and business case for forests? So it's great if companies come to us, based on a philanthropic driver
Yeah.
or an altruistic driver. They want to do the right
Yeah.
thing. They want to be seen to be doing the right thing. That's a great entry point. But ultimately, I don't see that as a resilient driver
Model.
or a sustainable
Yeah.
driver. We need something
Yeah.
that's going to stand the test of economic headwinds, that's going to be deeply embedded into the commercial mindset of an organization. So
Yeah.
the more that we can then position our work as fundamentally attached to those commercial
Yeah.
drivers, I think the more scale we're going to get, the more longevity we're going to get, and the more we're going to kind of take this from the margins to the mainstream.
Yeah. So in summary, basically, in the beginning, these corporates started with this PR, CSR based motivations, but then they understood that deforestation, environmental harm really has a risk on their supply chain. So I just heard recently that the cocoa price has raised five times in the past couple of years, because the conditions to grow cocoa has become much more difficult, due to different risks, disease, pests, droughts, floodings, whatever. And big companies like Nestle, Mars, and so investing substantially into their supply chains to stabilize them and to make their future business opportunities more stable and make them more resilient as a company. Yeah.
Yeah, I hadn't
So
heard that statistic, but I mean, it's a perfect
yeah,
example. If that doesn't
yeah,
get the attention of the boardroom and stimulate action, I don't know what will.
yeah. So Forest Forward works with some very recognizable names. So just to name one, like IKEA is one of the headline partners, but the coalition goes much broader across, tech, packaging, retail, manufacturing. Could you share a couple of examples from companies like, for example, HP, SIG, and explain why did they specifically join? What specific forest-related challenges were they trying to solve? And how their um, practical engagement look?
Yeah, as I said before, there's a number of different drivers and motivating factors behind these partnerships. SIG is a great example
Mhm.
of showing leadership. You know, they're a
Yeah.
major manufacturing company based out of Switzerland. They produce a lot of the liquid packaging that
Mhm.
you'll drink from. Um,
Yeah.
and like any company reliant upon forest resources or natural resources, they recognise that business dependency, and so they've invested a long time in ensuring that their products are FSC certified, so certified to the Forest Stewardship Council
Mhm.
to ensure sustainable production, and that's a certification scheme that WWF has a long history with and is a big supporter of. Once they've reached their 100% FSC certified, it became a question of what next. You know, we want to look beyond our own supply and make sure we're supporting sustainable forest production and forestry more broadly. And so they've worked with us for the last few years to meet a commitment that they made to protect, restore, or improve the management of 650,000 hectares of forests. That number is equivalent to their own forest footprint. So it's over and above what they already do by way of ensuring certified sustainable inputs. There are a number of different ways in which we work together to identify where we might, make those forest landscape investments that have business sense to the company, including within major markets in which they operate, but also supporting where WWF considers those areas of highest biodiversity, but also greatest threat. And we have a number of landscapes across the world where we really lean into in that sense. So SIG's got its own drivers that really represent strong leadership on forests. Another example I'll talk to briefly is on the other side of the supply chain, and
Mhm.
that's Interholco, who we work with on their management practices in the
Yep.
Congo Basin in the Republic of Congo. So, hugely important area for biodiversity,
Yep.
huge
Yep.
threats for
Yep.
deforestation, and it's one of these areas where timber production can be really part of the solution. And that's an
Yep.
interesting idea for a lot of people to get their head around. I remember starting with WWF and working very much on logging in the tropics as a conservation solution, which, as I said, is very counterintuitive. But the reality is,
Yep.
you know, if these communities and economies are not deriving value from these forests, they will be cleared, and they'll be planted with oil palm or some other agricultural crop.
Yeah.
So it's really about getting that
Using
optimal
or losing.
balance. Use it or lose it. That's right. So it's getting that optimal balance of can we get well managed forestry, the high value timber, can we get value addition in the local communities so that they're retaining as much value locally? Um, and can we, in doing that, still maintain the high conservation values within those
Yeah.
landscapes? So we're getting the
Yeah.
social and keep employment for local people.
Yeah.
So we're getting social
Yeah.
benefits, we're getting economic benefits, and we're getting environmental. And that's what logging, if done right, can do in these areas. And that's where FSC and other things can play an important role. So we've worked with Interholco for a number of years. They're FSC certified. We've supported them and worked with them in a number of different aspects. And I was talking to them just the other day about FSC and the value proposition there. And it can be challenging. There's transaction costs associated, but it's such an important part of their social license to operate in that area. And when attracting capital, when seeking additional finance, it was a really important indicator for sustainable management that their investors rely on. So there are really important benchmarks and indicators of sustainable management that can help mobilize capital. So it's that kind of thing we're working with them on. And on top of that, we're working with them on how do we go beyond timber production and help establish a diversified suite of revenue streams that can account for and start to monetize the forest ecosystem goods and services. There's huge amount of biodiversity in these landscapes, huge amounts of carbon. If your management practices are conserving and restoring those goods and services, how can we leverage emerging markets to bring in additional finance and further enhance the value proposition of investing in sustainable management practices? So it's that kind of proposition that we're working with our companies on, and where Interholco in the Congo Basin is a really good test case for really rethinking and reshaping what sustainable forest management looks like.
You mentioned in the beginning also that the reputational risk is quite high for corporate engagement. So basically, they want to avoid greenwashing. And now you mentioned with Interholco, for example, FSC's standard. But what kind of data verification mechanisms are you using? So we work, for example, with you in the Forest Forward program with the geoportal to show the progress in a transparent way on a map, which I think is one step. But what additional data and verification mechanisms are used to monitor these programs and make sure that the impact is effective?
Yeah, well, we promote transparency from our partners, and we really try to embed that as a core principle across our own program, so that we're walking the talk. And I love the work that we're doing with Open Forests that really visualizes it and aggregates it in an interactive way. And I see, as you said, what we describe as our impact portal, a map that you can click on partners, you can zoom into the landscapes they're working. I see that as a real nice combination of a monitoring function and a communications function, where we can both tell stories as well as showcase data and demonstrate the credibility that comes with it. So we work with our local partners there. So I run a small support unit that really coordinates the program globally, but ultimately, these partnerships sit with the various WWF national offices, and we work with them to ensure that we're kind of collecting the right data and we're bringing it together across the program in a way that's harmonized and consistent and of high quality. And one of the most important is around hectares under improved management, restoration or enhanced conservation, and that's the kind of thing that we can showcase on the portal in a visual sense, but we can also use in a way that can contribute to a whole range of commitments and targets, both internal and external. WWF's it's a big organization, at least as far as conservation organizations go. And so it's always a challenge to bring together what we do as an organization into a coherent picture and in a credible and quantitative way. And so we want to be able to contribute across WWF in a measurable way, but then we also want to contribute beyond WWF. We are actively engaged in pretty much every single multilateral fora or multi-stakeholder platform that you can think of, whether it's the Paris Agreement or the Global Biodiversity Framework or the New York Declaration on Forests, or you name it. And all of these have ambitious commitments. to forest conservation, restoration, but as I mentioned before, are often failing to actually deliver on those commitments. And so we want to be able to position our program in a way that contributes clearly and measurably to those commitments. And so data, monitoring, transparency is a really important piece of all that.
So we have talked about the why and the framework. Let's make a very concrete example. I want to dive a little bit deeper into the WWF Forest Forward program partnership with IKEA. This example is often cited really as a landmark example. So when you started the cooperation, I think this is supply chain of IKEA was, there were around 10% sustainably sourced, such as FSC certified and recycled wood. And today, IKEA exceeded 90% sustainably sourced timber and timber-related products. What did the operational side of this partnership look like?
Well, I mean, it started long before my time, not long before I was born, but certainly long before I started with WWF. And I mean, that goes to show just how long it is. It's 21, 22 years and counting. We've just kicked off the 8th phase of this partnership. So there's obviously a lot of history, a lot of trust, and between IKEA and WWF, a lot of influence and impact across the world's forests. And I think you might find they're sitting at probably 97 or 98%, if I'm not mistaken, FSC certified or recycled sources in their timber.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is, as you say, it's a huge achievement given the scale and complexity of their
It's not a
supply chain.
communication tweak, it's really a full supply chain transformation. So
yeah, they're a major timber user. There's no doubt about that. And so what I like about this is that, to get back to the recurring theme of this conversation, is there is a genuine commercial business driver for sustainable forest management. And so there's a deep commitment to achieving that and to working through the many barriers that we face across the globe in order to get there. And so, as with many of our partnerships, it's again, as before my time, but a lot of the initial focus was looking at the supply chains and the traceability and the transparency and the policy settings and the specifications. And a lot of that was focused on FSC as a key benchmark, as a key indicator for how do we achieve this, which is a really important part of FSC. An important reason for its existence is because it enables those far down the supply chain to take a consistent and efficient look at their supply chain. I mean, who can afford to go out and individually audit and monitor every single supplier across their supply chain? And so the FSC system enables buyers to have a certain degree of confidence in what they're buying. Of course, IKEA has gone a step further than that and, has additional traceability and transparency controls. But we won't go into too much detail there. But there's been a huge investment, a huge commitment, and a lot of work WWF's done to support that across the globe. It's never finished. It's an ongoing body of work. There's a lot of continual improvement, a lot of adaptation.
Yeah.
As with many of our partnerships, we've expanded beyond, supply chain focus into investing in landscapes. So, okay, well, where are some of these areas across the world that is of most concern, most interest to WWF and equally for IKEA? And how can we come together and work out where we can, best put our collaborative efforts to really make a difference on the ground? So often that'll land us in areas where IKEA sources from, given that's a strategic interest for us, and where that overlaps with areas where WWF has a strategic interest, then that's a sweet spot that we can kind of really work together on. And there's a number of those across the globe at the moment. We've just launched, as I said, this 8th phase of work. We've got active programs in Indonesia, in Vietnam, in Central Europe, in Brazil, in Colombia, in China. All of these places are of great interest to both organizations. There's probably one that to me typifies the transformational kind of impact and strategic nature of this partnership, and that's in Vietnam. I mentioned before, under Forest Forward, we have 3 broad action areas: responsible sourcing, improving forest management, and landscape finance.
Yeah.
We're building a portfolio of what we call flagship landscapes that can bring those 3 things together in one place. And that's in Vietnam, particularly in the Central Annamites landscape in Vietnam. That's happening under the IKEA partnership, where they're sourcing timber from this area. Therefore they're sending market signals and specifications and incentives through their own supply chain, and through the partnership, supporting forest managers on the ground, doing some really interesting stuff around supporting group certification for smallholder cooperatives to improve their management practices, specifically extend the rotation of harvests so there's more sustainability there, diversifying the biodiversity in the landscape. And by supporting these groups to get FSC certification, we're supporting really the productivity and profitability of those businesses. And
Yeah.
thirdly, supporting broader interventions in the landscape. So what are some of
Yeah.
those enabling conditions that can help attract other forms of finance, whether it's public or private? So I think that's a really nice example where you've got both organizations within the partnership have a strategic overlap there in Vietnam, and then through the partnership, we're combining responsible sourcing, improving forest management, and landscape finance. There's still a long way to go in this landscape and really everywhere, but I think it's a good example of some concrete steps that are headed in the right direction, and it's an area where WWF has a huge range of interests and initiatives and investments from other angles, other quarters. And so if we can strategically kind of position and integrate and leverage the work that we're doing under Forest Forward with the likes of IKEA to play a strategic role on what private sector leadership looks like specifically, that's what we're trying to do.
Yeah. Well, I think that's really a lighthouse project that shows how much can be done together in such a partnership. And yeah, I think it's a big success, of course, for the local projects, for the local environment. But maybe you can describe a little bit what is the return, if one can say, really speak about return for IKEA. Is it like the brand loyalty towards consumers? Is it more the resilience of their supply chain, or is it also helping IKEA get into or work with in their supply chain, maybe also finding new products like bamboo or other commodities which might also be extend their portfolio. So where do you see the most benefits also for a corporate that engages in the Forest Forward program, such as IKEA?
I mean, I hesitate a little bit to speak on their behalf.
Yeah.
And everything you've just mentioned there, I think, is of value to varying degrees. But if I had to speculate on where I see the most value and probably the most promise moving forward, it's around that supply chain resilience piece, particularly as we head into an era of increasing disruption from climate change or environmental degradation and other issues. We're seeing it's more and more important that companies know where they're sourcing their raw materials from and engage on the ground to ensure the environmental and social and economic resilience of those suppliers. So I think for an organization like IKEA, that is that is so important. And I think the work that we do together can play a really important and measurable contribution to that.
When you look a little bit at the market, what new market opportunities might emerge for companies that actively invest in nature positive materials models rather than simply trying to have less harm to the forest, to the nature there?
So if we're looking at tangible opportunities, business opportunities that can come from better natural resource management, the most obvious one that we've spoken about quite a bit is market access and kind of retaining market access. And we're seeing that through kind of regulatory and other drivers, such as the European deforestation regulation. Then you've got new revenue streams. And, two that we've touched on, at least briefly, are through biodiversity and carbon. There's obviously markets exist for carbon. There's emerging markets around biodiversity. These are increasingly offering potential new revenue streams for companies that operate in this space, and so well worth exploring. Resource efficiency is another one. So how can we do more with less? Whether it's land use, whether it's timber, whether it's other natural resources. And I think those three things combined can add up, into a relatively compelling value proposition for nature. And I guess connected to that is the market differentiation. How can I differentiate my product in the marketplace? But fundamentally, I'd probably look at it through the lens of currently the many goods and services that nature provides are not really factored in measurably to balance sheets, into economic decision making. But if we think of it in terms of, if nature were to send us an invoice for all the goods and services that she provides for free, what would we do differently as a business, is probably not a bad starting point.
Yeah, nice. So let's become really practical. If you look ahead 5 years, what is your vision for Forest Forward, in terms of impact, numbers of companies?
Yeah, good question. What is a vision? Number one, it's hopefully we've got to a tipping point of this business case that actually the economics of land use and forest management have tipped to the point where forest conservation and sustainable management and restoration is now outcompeting deforestation.
So you're not speaking about like the ecological tipping points into the negative side. So you're speaking more about like a social tipping point, that big organizations, big companies understand that sustainability is an important pillar of their own strategy.
Well, yeah, really the economic tipping point. So ideally, we spoke before about nature on the balance sheet. If we really get nature internalized into economic accounting, then it should represent a tipping point, so that conservation is going to outcompete deforestation, for example. So that's a kind of a big picture vision. Be nice by 2030. I think from a Forest Forward point of view, to have to play a role in getting there is critical. I think these flagship landscapes that I mentioned, if we can be really impactful at scale across 10 to 12 major landscapes across the globe, talking millions of hectares in each. I think the role that our program can play is less about necessarily doing it all directly, but more about demonstrating what good looks like, demonstrating what innovative new models and approaches look like, and then influencing others to take that to scale. So the hectares impacted under our program would be, just a starting point for what we can influence. The same goes for the amount of partners that we might work with. I've never gone into this thinking, we're currently working with 26. partners. Could be 200, but for me, it's not
Should
about the
be.
number of partners. It's about the
Yeah.
impact. I'd rather work
Yeah.
with 10 of
Yeah.
the most influential and impactful
Right.
partners and partnerships than with
Yeah.
1,000 companies. So I think
Yeah.
and to me, very much around taking a portfolio approach. So looking across the breadth of sectors and industries and geographies that are most influential when it comes to forests and forest management, and how
Yeah.
can we engage strategically across that breadth, across that portfolio, so
Yeah.
that we've got one really impactful partnership on this particular product or this particular sector, and another really impactful here, that each of which tells us something a little bit different, gives us a new angle, a new story, a new proof point, a new case study that combined gives us the full picture, of
Yeah.
how we need to manage forests and landscapes in a different
Yeah.
way.
Yeah. Well, I think you provided these lighthouse projects, and one can say you're really pulling this a movement from the private sector, from the conservational space. But what can policy finance do to support this process? We're speaking now about COP30 is coming up. What do you ask, let's say, the leaders to do to support and let's say accelerate this process?
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. It's a good question. We've spoken a lot about private sector and private sector leadership and the need or expectation that this is driven by commercial interest in order to get to scale. But government, public sector plays a huge role in that, in stimulating and unlocking, if you like, private sector action investment by putting the right policy frameworks in place. And I've
Yeah.
spoken a little bit about tipping points, about, on the one hand, we want to make it really more profitable, more economically viable to conserve and restore and sustainably manage forests. But there's the other side of that equation as well. We want to make it less profitable, less attractive, less economically viable to clear and degrade and fragment forests.
Yeah.
So we need policies and regulations and law enforcement on both sides of that ledger to achieve that vision. And we speak a lot about enabling conditions for attracting in private sector action investment. And that looks different in, different places, but it often comes down to strengthening forest governance. So
Yeah.
often when you scratch the surface of deforestation and forest degradation, there's often unclear or contested land rights, which leads to
Mm.
to basically a resource grab.
Yeah.
And often lands, and those with the most money, the most power, get the resources. So those enabling conditions starts with clear land rights, equitable, participatory, transparent land use planning, these kinds of things that can establish the right platform for sustainable management of landscapes. Law enforcement,
Yeah.
corruption, we're weeding out corruption, notorious in these sectors.
Yeah.
And a big one that's starting to get a bit of airtime that I hope really makes progress at COP30 is around repurposing harmful subsidies. So I spoke about making it not just more attractive to do the right thing, less attractive to do the bad thing. We still see a huge amount of public finance subsidizing activities that are harmful for the environment.
Mm. Yeah.
So repurposing those subsidies into
Yeah.
environmental restoration or conservation would make a huge difference, or at least putting safeguards around those subsidies so that
Yeah.
they're not contributing, for example, to deforestation. So I think things like repurposing harmful subsidies and putting policy frameworks to incentivize sustainable forest
Yeah.
management,
Yeah.
addressing land rights, all very difficult but important things that the public sector needs to do to stimulate
Yeah.
private sector.
Yeah, right. Well, so one example also related to IKEA, the introduction of FSC to different countries around the globe has really one of the most successful examples of introducing sustainability standards, because you can only get FSC certified if you work on a legal basis in those countries. And FSC has influenced many countries to adopt better forest policies. And so I'm just imagining, so IKEA sourcing from different places around the world, and they demanding FSC. So the local governments, they have to live up to it and improve their forests, their basic forest regulations to enable legality. So yeah, so I think this is a good example where you see how this private sector engagement also can push politics forward. And I really hope this is what WWF and the Forest Forward program, together with their partners, will do in the close future. So we are coming to an end, Tim. Thank you very much for making the business case for conservation so clear and for showing what credible, measurable impact can look like when companies commit for the long term.
Pleasure. I've enjoyed the conversation, Alexander. Hopefully we got some value out of it, and look forward to continuing working together.
So to everyone listening, I think today's message is crystal clear. Strategic investment in forests is not just about responsibility. It's about building more resilient, future-proof, and ultimately more successful businesses. So if you're a corporate leader wondering where to start, programs like WWF's Forest Forward program offer a proven path from risk and reputational management to real impact in some of the most critical forest landscapes. Thank you for tuning in to Beyond the Canopy. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share it with your colleagues in your sustainability or procurement team, and join us next time as we continue to explore game-changing links between business innovation and healthy planets. Have a good day. Goodbye.